All right, let's get right into it. Today we're going to break down some really complex and, let's be honest, often misunderstood ideas: race, ethnicity, and immigration, all through a sociological lens. So, why are we talking about this right now? Well, check this out. A recent poll found that 38% of Americans worry a great deal about race relations. Now, to give you some perspective, back in 2010, that number was just 13%. That is a massive jump, and it really tells you just how urgent this conversation has become. Okay, here's our game plan. We're going to start by defining race as a social construct. Then we'll look at how different groups actually interact. From there, we'll zoom in on the U.S. racial landscape, break down the difference between prejudice and discrimination, explore some theories that explain inequality, and finally, we'll touch on a few strategies for action. First things first, we've got to get our terms straight. And the most fundamental concept we need to tackle is race itself. It's so important to understand why sociologists see it as a social reality, not some kind of biological one. You see, for a long time, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the scientific approach was to treat race as a biological fact. This idea, which came to be known as scientific racism, tried to sort people into boxes based on physical traits. And it didn't stop there. It wrongly tried to connect things like skin color or hair texture to concepts like intelligence and morality. So, why did this whole idea just fall apart? Well, for a few huge reasons. First, there were no clear rules for who fit where. The categories were a mess. The physical traits they chose to focus on were also completely arbitrary. Why skin color and not, say, height? But the biggest blow came from modern genetics, which showed us that human migration and intermarriage have created this beautiful, continuous blend of traits, not a few distinct biological boxes. And of course, the horrific way the Nazis applied these theories, which led to the Holocaust, really served as the final tragic nail in the coffin for this concept in the scientific world. And that brings us to how we understand it today in sociology. Race isn't actually about biology. It's about what we, as a society, decide these physical differences mean. Like this quote says, "The meaning is all in the historical treatment of groups." It's a social construct, an idea that gets its power from our history, our culture, and our institutions. And you've got to distinguish that from ethnicity. While race is about perceived physical traits, ethnicity is all about a shared cultural heritage. You know, things like a common language, family traditions, religious beliefs, or national origin. It's why, for example, the U.S. government considers Hispanic an ethnicity, not a race. So, once society goes and creates these categories, what happens next? Well, these labels aren't just words. They have very, very real consequences for how different racial and ethnic groups end up interacting with each other. Sociologists tend to see these interactions on a kind of spectrum. At the most destructive end, you have things like genocide, the systematic attempt to annihilate a group of people. Then you have expulsion, like the Indian Removal Act, and segregation, think of Jim Crow laws. As you move toward cooperation, you see acculturation, where a minority group might adopt the culture of the dominant one, sometimes by force, like what happened in Native American boarding schools. And finally, at the other end, you have pluralism, where groups can coexist while keeping their distinct cultures, and assimilation, where they eventually merge completely into one group. Okay, now let's bring all of this home to the United States. How has this country officially categorized its people? And, just as importantly, how is that population changing right now? I mean, if you want proof that these racial categories are made up, just look at the U.S. Census over time. It's constantly changing. Back in 1790, there were 4 groups, including a category for enslaved individuals. That really shows you how the social context of the time, including ideas like the one-drop rule, shaped everything. Fast forward to 1960, and it's simplified to just white and non-white. And get this, it wasn't until the year 2000 that people were officially given the option to identify with more than one race. And the country's demographic makeup? It's changing dramatically. As you can see here, in 2023, the non-Hispanic white population made up about 59%, but by 2060, it's projected to be less than 45%. And at the same time, the Hispanic population is expected to grow from 19% to 27%. This is a major demographic shift we're living through. Okay, so we've got the context of these shifting categories and changing demographics. Now we need to get into the nitty-gritty, the mechanics of inequality. And that means we have to be super clear on 2 crucial but often confused terms: prejudice and discrimination. So here's the key difference, and it's a big one. Prejudice is an attitude. It's a thought, a feeling, a bias. Discrimination, on the other hand, is a behavior. It's an action that actually results in someone being treated unfairly. Now, you can have one without the other, but man, are they often deeply connected. And discrimination isn't just about one person being nasty to another. No, institutional discrimination is when the normal policies and procedures of our institutions, like schools or banks or the justice system, systematically lead to unequal outcomes. A classic example is historical redlining in housing, where banks would literally draw red lines on a map around minority neighborhoods and refuse to give them mortgages. Now, that didn't just segregate communities. It systematically blocked entire generations of families from building wealth through homeownership, a disadvantage that just keeps compounding over time. Nowadays, racism often shows up in more subtle ways. For instance, there's something called aversive racism. That's when prejudice is held by people who, on a conscious level, really see themselves as fair and unprejudiced. Then there's colorblind racism, which is the idea that just ignoring race is the solution. The problem is that approach often just ends up ignoring the very real disadvantages that people face. And then, of course, there's implicit prejudice. That's the subconscious bias that we might not even know we have. So we've defined the terms, we've seen the effects, but the big question is why? Why does this inequality continue to exist? Well, sociology gives us a few different lenses or theories to try and understand the root causes. A functionalist might look at this and say racial inequality is largely dysfunctional for society because it wastes so much human potential. Conflict theorists, on the other hand, they're all about power. They see racism as a tool used by dominant groups to maintain control and to divide the working class against itself. And then you have symbolic interactionists. They zoom way into our day-to-day lives and focus on how we learn stereotypes and attach meaning to race through our everyday conversations and interactions. It all comes back to this idea called the Thomas theorem. If people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. In other words, our made-up beliefs have very, very real effects. Knowing the theories is one thing, but what can actually be done about it? So let's pivot and talk about some strategies for action and debunk a few persistent myths, especially when it comes to immigration. Okay, here's a big one you hear all the time. Immigrants take jobs and drive down wages for everybody else. But what's the reality? Well, according to most economists, the data tells a very different story. Overall, immigration actually tends to have a small but positive impact on the wages of native-born workers. All right, what about the idea that immigrants are a drain on public resources? Again, the reality is quite different. Unauthorized immigrants, for one, are ineligible for most federal benefits. Not only that, they pay an estimated $11.7 billion in state and local taxes every single year. And on top of that, many contribute to Social Security, a system from which they themselves are not even eligible to draw benefits. And beyond disbusting myths, there are other strategies aimed at systemic change. You've got federal bodies like the EEOC, whose whole job is to investigate and fight employment discrimination. You have educational programs, often called DEI, that promote multicultural understanding in schools and workplaces. And you even have forms of what's called retrospective justice, like official government apologies or even reparations, which are designed to address the harms of the past. And all of this brings us back to the central paradoxical question of this whole topic. It's what we've been exploring this whole time. If race is something society just made up, if it's not a biological fact, then how and why are its consequences, from the wealth gap to health outcomes to our daily interactions, so profoundly and powerfully real? It's really something to think about.